Well, hello there. How are you? I hope everyone is doing well. This is your friendly neighborhood Canadian, RVD. Some people used to call me Reed, and I'm recording this video on my laptop, camera, microphone, my newer laptop purchased last year, but still, I apologize. It's not my normal, uh, better YouTube camera and microphone because those are in Edmonton, and I am not in Edmonton. And I haven't been in Edmonton in over 30 days. Not part of the plan at all. At all. I packed for 1 week. Who knew the world would stop? Anyway, recording in my hotel room. At least this pandemic that we're not allowed to really talk about has made me have the time, besides working all the time, to record some YouTube videos because you find inspiration in the weirdest ways. So, anyway, this is part of my wrestling section. Finally, doing a whole bunch of YouTube videos about my former past love of professional wrestling: WWE, WWF, NWA, WCW, AWA, ECW, TNA, all that stuff. This is episode 2 of WrestleMania Dream Matches that never happened. So, I'm doing these videos in chronological order, according to WrestleManias that I thought dream matches should have taken place. WrestleMania 8, April 5th, 1992, I want to say. Now, the card itself was an interesting card because it had Bret Hart meeting Roddy Piper for the Intercontinental Championship. It was supposed to have the Legion of Doom versus the Natural Disasters for the WWF Tag Team titles, but I think HULK was suspended at the time. There were some drug issues there, so they were replaced by, oh no, wait, Money Incorporated. Sorry, Money Incorporated were the WWF World Tag Team Champions, Ted DiBiase and Arn Shyster, and they were gonna meet Legion of Doom, which would have been awesome. But HULK was suspended, and then they replaced Legion of Doom with Natural Disasters, Earthquake, and Typhoon. Money Incorporated obviously kept the tag team titles, I'm pretty sure. I think. Yeah, they did. I think so. And then, but the Legion of Doom showed up at WrestleMania 8 in an interview segment, reintroducing their longtime manager, Precious Paul Ellering, who was brand new to the WWF Road Warrior Legion of Doom gimmick. Lex Luger made his first appearance at WrestleMania 8 because he had signed on with the World Bodybuilding Federation, the WBF. So Lex Luger had just left WCW, where he was the reigning WCW World Champion. He was top heel. He was managed by Harley Race. He was doing awesome. He left WCW. Vince McMahon lured him to be the main star of the W. Anyway, going back in time, 1992 is a crazy time. We had 2 double main events for WrestleMania 8. We had Hulk Hogan wrestling Sid Justice in like a grudge match, which was interesting. And it was billed as Hulk Hogan's last match because there was a huge steroid scandal involving Hulk Hogan, Vince McMahon, the WWF, and a whole bunch of wrestlers. Mostly because of superstar Billy Graham, Jesse the Body Ventura, ex-wrestlers, the New Jersey, New York State Health Board, all that stuff, Sports Commission, a whole bunch of stuff. So Hulk Hogan was, taking his vitamins. And yeah, they agreed he was going to lay low. So it was billed as Hulk Hogan's farewell match, retirement match, I think. And then the other main event was WWF World Heavyweight Champion, the Nature Boy, Ric Flair, defending against the Macho Man, Randy Savage, who had lost a career-ending match at WrestleMania 7. Which, anyway, let's not talk about that. We're here to talk about the match, the dream match that should have happened at WrestleMania 8. It blew my mind. It blew my mind as a fan that this match didn't happen because I was hardcore in professional wrestling. I was a huge fan. I was involved. I knew I was learning about the ins and outs, how matches worked, money making, booking, storylines. I was super invested, super getting involved, learning that it was a gimmick, that it was a con, that obviously matches were predetermined and everything. But the superstar match everyone expected, they even had it booked for a little while, was going to be Hulk Hogan versus Ric Flair for the WWF World Heavyweight title. That was supposed to be the main event of WrestleMania 8. And it was even booked that way, and it was set up that way for a couple weeks. I remember Jack Tunney, president of the WWE, making that announcement. And this was huge because, to bring you back to 1992, Ric Flair had just won the Royal Rumble in January. The 1992 Royal Rumble is generally regarded as one of the best Royal Rumbles ever, with some of the best wrestlers of all time, and one of the best performances was Ric Flair, because Ric Flair entered the Royal Rumble at number 3, and at that point, the World Heavyweight Championship was vacant. So Jack Tunney also announced that the winner of the Royal Rumble would also become the new WWF World Heavyweight Champion. And Ric Flair made professional wrestling history and WWF history at the time, and it was a record that held on for a long time. Ric Flair entered at number 3. He eventually wrestled over an hour, 62 minutes, put on a great, fantastic performance, and was the last man standing, and Ric Flair made history by becoming only the second wrestler in pro wrestling history to be a former NWA World Champion and a WWF World Heavyweight Champion. It was amazing. I remember that because I was huge Ric Flair fan. I loved that he came to WWF. I was super on board with his gimmick. Bobby the Brain Heenan, Mr. Perfect Kurt Hennig in his corner as his background. Loved it all. So Ric Flair was the WWF World Heavyweight Champion. And this is Ric Flair, the man who was named Wrestler of the Decade by Pro Wrestling Illustrated for the 80s. And at the time, I was drinking that Ric Flair juice hardcore. You would have asked me for a long time in that time period, I would have told you Ric Flair was the greatest wrestler of all time. Now, 2020, if you're a smart fan, you know Ric Flair is not the greatest wrestler of all time. Many people will tell you he is, maybe wrestling experts and fans, but honestly, you can dissect Ric Flair. You can dissect Ric Flair's matches, especially in the 80s, that once you saw a Ric Flair match a couple times, that was the same Ric Flair match over and over and over. He did the same spots. He did the same moves. He wrestled everybody for an hour, wrestled everybody for 45 minutes. It was a show, but it was like the same show. He wasn't like other wrestlers who changed it up. Ric Flair was very... you could count on Ric Flair to be Ric Flair. And his hour-long matches had a certain theme, had a certain pattern. And hey, it made money. It was great, but this was long before the internet. And people like to go back in history and hope and, over glamorize things. If you really get into it, Ric Flair is still one of the greatest wrestlers of all time. He's one of the greatest talkers and one of the greatest characters of all time. But you can't honestly fight a real wrestling fan and go Ric Flair was one of the best wrestlers of all time, when you can go, no, he wrestled the same match for a decade. That's not the best wrestler of all time. That's doing the same show. That's putting on a great performance, but it's not being a different in-ring style performer. But anyway, this is 1992, and Ric Flair had just spent most of his entire career ruling the National Wrestling Alliance, the NWA, who just recently become World Championship Wrestling. And in the NWA, Ric Flair was a 7-time NWA World Heavyweight Champion. He was by far one of the greatest world champions of all time. No one's going to dispute that. Ric Flair is the greatest NWA World Champion of all time. Whether he wrestled the same matches or not, Ric Flair is the greatest NWA World Champion of all time. He'd held the title 7 times, many long championship reigns. He was their biggest moneymaker. He was their top star. Sometimes he was a babyface, but most of the time he was a heel. Leader of the Four Horsemen, managed by J.J. Dillon, limousine riding, all that stuff. And when Ric Flair is in this corner, keeping the NWA alive, Jim Crockett Promotions, all that stuff. And then over here, you have Hulk Hogan and Vince McMahon and the New York World Wrestling Federation that had taken over the world in the 80s. So you had Hulk Hogan, who was the biggest star in professional wrestling at that point. Hulk Hogan was the number one moneymaker, number one draw, number one superstar, most popular professional wrestler in the world for a long time. Hulk Hogan's records, as much as Hulk Hogan, when you look back at him now, and he's a scumbag, he's an egomaniac, he's a liar, he manipulated people, he was insecure, he was selfish, he was greedy, he was just a bad human being. At that point, Hulk Hogan was the top star. This was a few years before someone named Stone Cold Steve Austin would come along. And then, a couple decades before a guy named John Cena would come along. So you have Hulk Hogan, who's the king of the WWF. And at this point, Hulk Hogan was a former four-time WWF World Champion. So this was huge. This was huge. This was what dream matches were made of. This is what wrestling fans were waiting for. Because back in the 80s, late 80s, there were two camps. You were either NWA or you were WWF. And that's how it was. It wasn't like you're either NWO or you're WCW. It was you were NWA fan or you were a WWF fan. And very few divisions like that existed. And Ric Flair and Hulk Hogan, the two biggest superstars of the 80s, by far, the two biggest wrestlers of all time, the biggest names, the top world champions. Say what you want about Hulk Hogan in the 80s. He had a 4-year reign as WWF World Champion, right? Then he had another reign for like a year. Then he had another reign for like 7 or 8 months. Hulk Hogan helped make the WWF what it was. And this was the dream match everyone wanted to see. And when Ric Flair left WCW to sign with Vince McMahon and the WWF, everyone's like, okay, it's only a matter of time. It's only a matter of time. Now the rumors, because, you find out stuff over the years, and obviously, I watched the history of the WrestleMania video and DVD, Blu-ray, whatever. And yeah, there were Hulk Hogan, Ric Flair matches booked at house shows across some parts in the United States. And apparently, I don't see how, if you put Hulk Hogan and Ric Flair in the main event, how that doesn't sell out, how that isn't a top draw. Now, especially on pay-per-view, because as we know, in 1994, when WCW flipped the script and had signed Hulk Hogan to WCW and Ric Flair was the World Heavyweight Champion, they did a little pay-per-view called Bash at the Beach in 1994 that became WCW's #1 pay-per-view of all time, and then eventually was their second greatest pay-per-view of all time, because then Starrcade 97 happened. But Hulk Hogan and Ric Flair in 1994, 2.5 years after WrestleMania 8, became the top-selling pay-per-view in wrestling history, if not one of them. The biggest pay-per-view for WCW. So when WWF people like Bruce Pritchard back in the day and all the WWF company men towing the line, they're lying to you. Hulk Hogan versus Ric Flair being the main event of WrestleMania 8 for the WWF World Heavyweight Championship would have been gangbusters. I think WrestleMania 8 was in Indianapolis, I think. The Hoosier Dome, maybe? I think it had 68,000 fans there. It was a huge, huge crowd. But I mean, and I'm pretty sure WrestleMania 8 did great on pay-per-view, especially with the Hulk Hogan's last match. But you could have done that with the world title match, because Ric Flair is your WWF World Champion, and you have him fighting the All-American, the greatest WWF superstar of all time, Vince McMahon. Imagine not only the pay-per-view buy rates that would have increased, maybe some more people would have attended the live show, but you could have sold that. The VHS box covers alone of WrestleMania 8, the first ever matchup between Hulk Hogan and Ric Flair, history being made, professional wrestling history being made. The top NWA star, even though they really couldn't talk about Ric Flair's past, they just acknowledged he was a world champion, and he came there with the NWA World Heavyweight title, and they had to pixelate the belt, but he came there with the title because WCW wouldn't give him the money. You had to pay a deposit as champion to hold that title in the NWA, and they didn't want to give him his money back. So Ric Flair took the title, and Vince McMahon was like, Ric Flair's like, "Do you want me to come to I have the NWA title," and Vince McMahon was like, "Bring it. I'll put it on TV." So it's funny when Vince McMahon, was so happy to put the NWA World title on TV in 1991 in the fall, but almost 8-9 years later, Vince McMahon is crying because Alundra Blaze is, taking the woman's title and putting it in the garbage, and worried that Bret Hart would take the WWF title to WCW Monday Nitro. It's funny. Vince McMahon's a hypocrite, and he's one of the most evil men on earth. So that's a whole other discussion. But the ramifications of that Superstar Dream Match, that was the dream match of all dream matches. The top NWA wrestler, money-making superstar, Ric Flair, the Nature Boy, versus WWF's number one moneymaker, babyface, superstar, hero to the people, the legendary All-American Hulkamania, Hulk Hogan, in a WrestleMania match for the WWF World title. Even if Hulk Hogan wins, maybe he retires as champion, and then you have a tournament for the world title. Or you do the shocking thing, and you have Ric Flair go over Hulk Hogan. Then Hulk Hogan has to come back because he lost his final match. That would have been amazing. That is what wrestling fans back then envisioned as a dream match. As a dream match. And to have it at WrestleMania, that would have been amazing. But that's not what happened. And it kind of sucks because we should have had it at WrestleMania. That should have been the main event. I don't know what you would have done with Macho Man Randy Savage at WrestleMania 8. Maybe he fights Jake the Snake Roberts again. Maybe he fights The Undertaker. I don't know. I don't know what you would have done with Sid Justice. Maybe Sid Justice, maybe Sid Justice fights Macho Man Randy Savage. That's an easy fix, actually. It would be a weird, interesting match, but you could have made it work. But to not have Hulk Hogan and Ric Flair in the main event of WrestleMania 8 in 1992, when all the stars were aligning, is insane. That Vince McMahon didn't do that. It's insane that the WWF propaganda machine wants to tell the WWE Universe, "Oh, that wouldn't have been a good idea." When WCW does it at Bash at the Beach in July 1994, and it's their biggest pay-per-view in the history of pay-per-views. Even Shaquille O'Neal was at Bash at the Beach. Mr. T was Mr. T, but you know what I'm saying? That match made fucking media history. And that was 1994. This is 1992. WWF is at the top of its game. And you don't put Hulk Hogan and Ric Flair in the main event of WrestleMania 8 for the world title? No matter how it goes. You have Flair and Hogan in the main event. Maybe Flair pushes Hogan. Maybe Hogan actually breaks out some wrestling moves that he used in Japan, that he used in Rocky III. It would have been a spectacle. It would have been history-making event. And that's what WrestleMania should be. And that's what dream matches were about, especially in those awesome, innocent days of just steroid scandals. That would have been amazing to see. So that is a superstar dream match that never happened at WrestleMania that should have. And that's like when you want to, if you want to criticize Vince McMahon for being more lucky than a genius, for Vince McMahon not being the greatest, wrestling mind of all time, you can make some very good arguments and counterpoints. And one of them is Vince McMahon, the genius, didn't put Hulk Hogan and Ric Flair in the main event of WrestleMania 8. That match itself would have sold VHS copies hundreds of thousands times over, would have made pay-per-view history. You could have dined out on that match for a long time because obviously Hulk Hogan was coming back. And who knows? Maybe WrestleMania 9 is the rematch. Who knows? But the fact that we didn't get Hulk Hogan, and we didn't even get it on any pay-per-view in the WWF. Not that there were a lot of pay-per-views back then. Like, it's mind-boggling. You have the two biggest money-making stars of all time. That's like Vince McMahon not making a match with Steve Austin and The Rock in their prime. That match headlined 3 WrestleManias. You're telling me Hulk Hogan versus Ric Flair couldn't headline 1? Even the most diehard WWE internet sheep fans have to be like, Reed, RVD, you're right. Hulk Hogan versus Ric Flair, WrestleMania 8, should have happened. And it's sad that it didn't. So instead, we got Hulk Hogan beating Sid Justice by disqualification because Papa Shango ran in. And then we had the return of the Ultimate Warrior, which would have been great. Imagine Flair beats Hogan. Flair pins Hogan. He's still the WWF World Champion. Hulk Hogan just wrestled his last match. Boom! Cue Ultimate Warrior's music. Boom! There's your next feud. Ultimate Warrior comes out to save Hulk Hogan, to challenge Ric Flair moving forward. That's how you end a WrestleMania. But to be fair, we did get a pretty good match between Macho Man Randy Savage and Ric Flair for the WWF World title, where Macho Man Randy Savage beat Ric Flair to become a 2-time WWF World Heavyweight Champion. That was a pretty good match. And there is a storyline over Miss Elizabeth and how Ric Flair and Elizabeth might have had a relationship in the past and shenanigans and stuff. But wouldn't have Hulk Hogan versus Ric Flair been better? Couldn't that have been more money? And then you use the return of the Ultimate Warrior to challenge Ric Flair in the future? Would have been interesting. It's also insane that Vince McMahon didn't even try to do a WWF version of the 4 Horsemen during that time. He was kind of they're like little teases, hints, but that would have been gangbusters. Ric Flair, WWF World Champion in 1992, and then you reform the 4 Horsemen. Then you have them fighting against Ultimate Warrior, returning Ultimate Warrior, Macho Man Randy Savage, maybe Bret Hart, maybe Roddy Piper, Sid Justice and Ric Flair team up. Maybe Mr. Perfect is a member of the 4 Horsemen. Who knows what could have happened? 1992 was a crazy time. But anyway, that's just one Canadian man's thoughts on WrestleMania Dream Matches that never happened. Hulk Hogan versus Ric Flair, WrestleMania 8. Thanks for watching this video. Give me a thumbs up. Make some comments. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm still stuck in this hotel in small town Alberta. I feel like the end is near. Anyway, cheers. Happy Easter. I'm recording this on Easter Day, April 12th, 2020. Yeah. Thanks. Have a great day. Happy Easter. Happy Passover. Cheers. Stay safe. Stay healthy. Stay informed. Stay calm. Stay home over the beer virus. Cheers. Until we meet again.